Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Engineering for Change's webinar series. Today, we're excited to present with Emily Brosher on navigating cross-cultural differences on international development projects. My name is Yana Aranda, and I will be your moderator for the day. I am from the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in the Engineering for Global Development sector. All right, so I'm having a little bit of trouble moving my slides here. Give me just a moment, everyone. There we go. Alrighty, so I wanted to tell you a little bit more about the E4C Webinar Series. As I mentioned, Emily Brosher was going to be presenting today from Refresh Intercultural Communications, of which she is the founder. A little bit of a shout out to our webinar coordinators today from a team across multiple organizations, Alex Chores of IEEE, Steve Welch of IEEE, myself, and we also have Holly Brown, who is unfortunately missing from the slide, but will be also a critical part of the team. If you have any questions about the webinar series, do feel free to contact us at the email below. And of course, you might want to know a little bit more about Engineering for Change and who we are. And yes, it's evening there. I just saw that note. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be. So Engineering for Change is a community of over actually 9,500 engineers, technologists, NGOs, and social scientists who are all working together to develop solutions and share solutions to solving all the critical global development human challenges in the world today. We invite you to join us and access a growing catalog of field-tested solutions and related information from our entire coalition, including EWB USA, IEEE, as well as academic partners such as MIT's D-Lab, Practical Action, and others. So registration is easy and it's free, so do join us on engineeringforchange.org. And today you have joined our webinar series. This is a series of free, publicly available webinars. We are focused on sharing best practices and lessons learned about solutions employing technology to solve global humanitarian and development challenges. Of course, we have more information about our upcoming webinars on the webinar series website listed here. And we're very excited to share with you our webinar that's going to be in May. On May 24th, we're going to be doing a joint webinar with Practical Action, a wonderful NGO who's been doing work for many years on the ground. And it's going to be our webinar in advance of Rio 20. So we invite you to join us. The focus is going to be on energy access, and we're going to have two wonderful speakers, Drew Corbin, who is an energy consultant with Practical Action, and Evan Thomas, who is the Executive VP of Mana Energy. You can register for free via the website listed here that we discussed already, and we'll be sharing more information with you all on that soon. So you're here, and we would like to make sure to know a little bit more about you. So at this time, we invite you to enter your name and location in the Q&A window on the left side of the screen. Some of you have already done so, and thank you very much. We see we have a diverse crowd already. And of course, I want to remind you that you can type in any questions you have during the webinar in the Q&A window. The presenter will answer all the questions at the end of the presentation. Following this webinar, we do encourage you to get your professional development hour for the session if that is something you're using for your certification. It is accessible via the email address listed here, and we'll speak about this again, and we'll provide you with a code at the end of this webinar for that certificate. So a little bit about today's presenter, Emily Brocher is the founder of Refresh, and she is also the lead facilitator. She holds not one, but 2 Masters of Arts degrees from the University of Denver in Cultural Anthropology and International and Intercultural Communication. Emily's expertise in delivering powerful skill-building trainings that offer the tools and awareness needed to minimize miscommunication across cultures in professional settings. Fundamentally, her trainings equip people with the tools to manage the complexity of intercultural communication. Over the past decade, she has traveled to over 30 countries and worked in 10 developing countries, including 2 years of service with the U.S. Peace Corps in the Republic of Kiribati in the Central Pacific. Her graduate studies concentrated on intercultural conflict management, international development, participatory action research, and collaborative research with vulnerable populations. We're very excited to welcome Emily and to learn a little bit more about navigating cross-cultural differences on international development projects. So with that, I invite Emily to take over the mic and share with us her presentation.
Hello, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I'm so excited to see such a diverse group of people on this webinar today. And I'm so excited to talk about a subject that I'm extremely passionate about, which is how do we navigate cross-cultural differences on international development projects. So to tell you a quick bit about myself before I continue on to the presentation and a bit of training I'm going to do today. I did the Peace Corps about 12 years ago in the Republic of Kiribati in the Central Pacific. And at that point, I started to see some major issues that were going on in the world of development with regards to projects that were being implemented that were just simply not sustainable. And I started to ask the question, how do we better offer sustainable solutions to the problems that we can see globally? And so today I want to explore just some of the common pitfalls that I have seen and other people have seen in development and look at what we can learn from those mistakes. And I'm going to offer some communication tools that help address those issues. And this is really all for the goal of making development more sustainable, holistic, and integrated. So this is going to be a great presentation for anyone who has been on the ground or collaborated with people internationally and just found frustration in that process and wanting it to go better and having really great solutions and ways to meet the needs of people in different parts of the world, but just not finding a good fit. So in the last webinar, Nathan Johnson presented a really great model looking at how you create a systemized understanding of a development project, which is including the technical, environmental, and human systems aspects. So the emphasis here is that having a technical solution in itself does not mean that you have a great sustainable project. And so you have to take the environmental factors into consideration when you're designing the project, and you definitely have to take the human factors into consideration. And so today I'm really going to focus on the human factor element. And why, again, why am I focusing on this? It's because this is kind of how I see the current state of development. I see that we have a lot of solutions out there, and we have ways to filter water. We have ways to address the needs of people on the ground, but we just haven't fully brought it together at this point. It's not fully integrated. I'm going to present a couple examples in a moment of how this lack of integration is really looking on the ground, what we can learn from it. So I'm just going to jump into those solutions. And if you have questions, please raise your hand using the raise hand option here on the left-hand side, and I'll try to answer as we go along. And if not, we have time for question and answer at the end. So the examples that I want to start with for looking at, how can we learn how to do international development better by looking at what has gone wrong. So one example that I think is pretty compelling is this example of a fish processing plant that was built on Lake Turkana in Kenya. this was built in the 1980s by the Norwegian government, and the idea was to provide options for income in this rural, remote area in Kenya by building a fish processing plant on the shores of a giant lake. And so they spent $22 million building this plant. What they did not take into account was that most of the people that lived near Lake Turkana are nomads, with no history of fishing or eating fish. In fact, it's a society where where owning cattle is actually a sign of wealth. So fishing didn't actually hold much interest for them. They're nomads, so they're rarely in the same area for a long amount of time, which is needed to maintain a plant like that. And due to its geographical remoteness, it wasn't easy for someone more fishing-centered group or to just move up there and start working the plant. So basically, it was actually only open a few days, and then it was shut down because the cost to freeze and get clean water in the desert were just way too high. So that was $22 million for a plant that is just sitting there. And when you look at what went wrong, what was the flawed approach in that, it was, definitely people with good intentions wanting to help out a community in a remote area, but they brought in their own perspective on what would be good for the community. In Norway, there's obviously a long history of fishing culture, and the assumption was that that would be good in this other culture halfway around the world. And it simply ended up being a waste of resource when the context wasn't taken into account. Another example is this e-government project in India. This was implemented in 2000 in Madhya Pradesh in India, and it was actually a really innovative approach to government, where in this rural area the government started installing a series of computer kiosks or internet kiosks to provide government service and access to information such as welfare schemes and public grievances, land ownership documents, and a chat with the expert option where you could get farming tips, market prices, and things like this to remote areas. So it had a lot of potential benefits in terms of allowing people in remote areas to access resources and also save money on travel. It was awarded a number of different awards, but after 2 years, some pretty major flaws started to become apparent. One of the big ones there was in these areas where they were installed, there was a lot of electricity outages. So not only was the internet not available a lot of the time, when it was, people would, flood the circuits with requests, and it would be extremely slow and frustrating. Another reality on the ground was that there was a lot of government and leadership turnover in these areas, and what was needed to maintain the web kiosk was a lot of maintenance in terms of updating the website, getting things up to date. And so there's long periods of abandonment as the leadership was turned over. There's lots of inconsistencies. And so what's happened now is a third of these kiosks are permanently closed. It's actually led to corruption in different places as people have tried to bribe to get access to the kiosks. And again, we see an example of, really innovative technological solutions to issues on the ground. But in these projects, what we're not seeing are these fully coming together in a way that address the needs in a sustainable fashion. And in both of these examples, we see that the whole picture, the context of where the projects were being implemented was not fully integrated into the project design. So the projects were not sustainable, and they were wasteful, and they were not useful. And they didn't, in the long term, they didn't address the needs, the pressing needs of these communities. And I am not the only one that has seen these issues come up. There's an organization in New York called Failfair, And what they do is they gather people together to look at international projects and say, okay, what has gone wrong and what can we learn from it, which is a really important way of moving forward, is to get people collaborating on their mistakes and learning from each other. And what they found, a key theme throughout Failfair, was the importance of working closely with end users throughout the design and implementation of projects, so that projects reflect the end users' needs, address their points of pain, and the reality of their technological use. So again, I have seen, and other people are identifying, that the context of where projects are put into place needs to be fully integrated into the project in order for us to have sustainable and successful projects. The reality is, collaboration on this scale is not a new idea. But the question is, why aren't we doing it better? Why don't we see wide-scale collaborative efforts going on everywhere where we can create really successful projects? People started to talk about participatory methods back in the 60s. We talked about communication, community engagement, and collaborative projects, and involving local voice, starting in the 60s with a critical thought movement in academics. And basically, you know, here we are 50 years later, and we're just not doing it very well. And this is what I saw on the ground, and started to ask, you know, what is going on? And so what I want to ask you guys really quickly, because you have a lot of experience as well, and if you could just type into the chat box the answer to this question, if you have one. Have you had issues when trying to include local voices in project design? If yes, what were the issues? So when I say local voices, I'm basically talking about doing things that are participatory, so that people from the country that you're providing services to are able to contribute to your project design and implementation. This is kind of how I define participatory work. So I'll give it a couple moments to see if someone wants to write something in. They did not fully appreciate the time involved in development project. Yes, this is true. Most often the issues are about social justice. Yes, most of us engineers do not know how to handle these issues. Great. It's difficult to get the women, yes, in the community involved, since it is a male-dominated culture. Great. So thank you so much for the, okay, I have one more. People have divergent points of view on solving some problems not being constructive. So these are great examples, and I'm happy to see that all of you are kind of sharing the same frustrations that I had, and saying, you know, this is actually not something that's so easy to do. You know, what we see right now is a lot of people writing in participatory methods into their project design, but when they get on the ground, it's actually a lot harder to do than it seems. As you guys have pointed to, some of these issues include time. It actually takes a lot of time to include local voices, because as someone else just put up there, you have language barriers, you have misunderstandings. This is a key one that I focus on, this misunderstandings when you're working with people with entirely different worldviews, entirely different perspectives. Someone else mentioned entirely different approaches to problem solving. And then you're expected to work on something with limited time and limited resources. And this is not really an equation for success. It's frustrating. There's a sense of not having progress. So what we see as a trend is that people have identified that we need to be more participatory on the ground in order to have sustainable solutions. Yet when we get on the ground, it's really hard. And so again, like we need to take the context into account, because we've seen that not taking it into account, like those two examples that I mentioned, will lead to lack of sustainability, wastefulness, projects that are not useful. So let me give you a quick example of what a participatory method might look like and why it might be frustrating for folks who don't have as much direct experience. So one simple example is having focus groups. So let's say you have some technology around introducing water filtration systems into a village, a remote area. This is a picture of Pakistan. I just had it up there so you guys have something to look at. So you know that you want to include local voices in order to make a more integrated design. But when you get on the ground and you start to say, okay, who needs to be there, things start to get a little bit more complicated. You realize that if you have a group of men and a group of women, and it's a mixed group, you might have women holding their voices back, or you might have men offering ideas that the women don't agree with. So then you decide to have two separate groups of men and groups of women. And then you have to consider, okay, who's facilitating that group? How comfortable are they with the facilitator? Do you need to have elders in that community there? Is there some sort of, and as you unravel it more, there are more and more questions. Is there some sort of prestige to being in a focus group? Perhaps there's a stigma to working with foreigners and being involved with foreigners. So all of this starts to kind of, when you get on the ground and you start to incorporate the local culture and local perspectives, things start to get a lot more complicated. And that is really what we're looking at here. Is it's not just that we need to ask questions when we get on the ground in order to create a great integrated design. It's that we actually need to know how to ask questions and how to get answers that we can work with, which can then lead back into our projects. So what I have kind of seen in my years on the ground is that we need to get better at asking questions. We need to really refine our capacity for including local voices. And we can do teamwork activities, we can do focus groups, we can do surveys, we can do community mapping with local partners. And these are all things that I help my clients design and implement. But the first thing that we need to focus on to do this effectively is we need to be competent at communicating across cultures. So we need to get better, and I say we on a global scale. I see this across the board in development projects, and I struggle with it myself when I'm on the ground. We need to become more competent at communicating across worldviews. This doesn't just have to do with language, but it really has to do with our perspective. To be able to get to a point that we can get answers that we can work with and that we understand. So I'm going to back up here after saying that, just ask really quickly, does anyone have a specific question on that, something they don't understand? I can answer maybe one question, or if everyone's good, I'll go on. Okay, great. We will, that's a very short amount of time, we will come back to questions in a second. So what I want to do is offer you some more information today. It's going to be somewhat of a condensed training, and please know that with the company that I own, Refresh Intercultural Communication, this is principally what we do. We offer training for the specialists that are then on the ground and doing the work. And this is kind of a taste to give you an idea of the angles that you can go to be better prepared to do the participatory work that will lead to a sustainable project. So when I'm talking about communicating across cultures, I'm really talking about intercultural communication. So I define communication by creating shared understanding. So between two people, they need to be understanding the same thing. And intercultural communication is creating shared understanding when various perspectives are present. And the various perspectives part, when we start talking about vastly different cultural ideas, this is when the various perspectives start to get very complicated. So let's break this down even further. This is a model that I often use in my trainings, and I find it really effective. So let's say we have these two people, person A and person B, and they're coming together to work on a project. Person A has this idea, and the idea in this context is safe water. This is an example I've been using quite a bit throughout this presentation, so I'll just keep going with it. So the example is an idea of safe water. They need to communicate that to person B, and maybe it's in the sentence of like, we need to make sure this community has safe water. Safe water being the key idea within that sentence. So what they then do is they call on their understanding of language. They also call upon different tools such as facial expressions, voice intonation, eye contact or lack of eye contact, all of the repertoire of body language, as well as their understanding of the context of the situation. Where is this conversation happening? And they encode that information. So they create a way to transmit that information. Person B then has the opportunity to decode that information. And what they call upon is their understanding of language, their understanding of body language, and their understanding of the context. This gets pretty problematic quite quickly. As you can see in this, there's a lot of room for interpretation. So as this process is happening, person A is talking about their idea of safe water, and person B is then creating another idea of safe water. What we really see happening, regardless of cultural context, is you see this interpersonal gap happening, and that interpersonal gap is basically the area for interpretation, and it's where assumptions feed in. So let's say person A is from one area of the world where their idea of safe water means water without any sort of debris in it. That's what safe water means to them. Person B is from another area, let's say they're an engineer, where safe water means water that's been tested for arsenic, or perhaps water that's been boiled, or at minimum water that's gone through some sort of filtration system. So it gets to be an interesting conversation then when this person's saying, yes, our community needs safe water, and this person says, yes, we can get your community safe water. And it's like they're having two different conversations. And this happens all the time, all the time. Another way of thinking about it is that person A in the situation has one lens, one understanding of what's happening, and person B has another lens, another understanding of what's happening. They're going back and forth, assuming, this is the big words in communication when you start looking at miscommunication, they're assuming that they're talking about the same thing when actually they're not. So what does that look like when we start, really, that's just a model. So what does it look like when we start really interacting? It's an example of different lenses that we wear when we look at the world and how things can get pretty complicated quickly. So let's say I'm from one area of the world and I'm sitting inside my house, and I look outside and I see someone carrying an umbrella. And my assumption is that if they're carrying an umbrella, maybe they know some information about the weather that day that I don't know. And maybe I should include an umbrella in my bag, and I'm going to go out and be wondering if it's going to rain, and be looking around, and based on seeing this one thing, I have this whole set of assumptions of what might be happening. Someone from another part of the world may look out of the window and may not have the same assumption around whether it's raining or not, or it's going to rain. Their assumption is going to be that the person carrying the umbrella is going to be using that umbrella for shade that day, because in their culture, having dark skin is not thought of as something that's very beautiful, and so they want shade to protect their skin. So this is an example of you have the same thing, the same objective thing that we're looking at, and two different lenses based on two different parts of the world that you're from that lead you to two different assumptions of what's happening, and then you start acting on those assumptions. And this is what happens every single moment of the day. This is just kind of how we interact with communication between people and how we interact with culture. Another example that might feel a little bit more relevant to some of your projects is the use of contracts. And in this example, I'm going to get a little bit more specific. So in the U.S., the use of contracts is really a vital process to any sort of business negotiation. And when you prepare a contract, you go over each and every word, making sure that it's saying exactly what you want it to say and describing things down to extreme detail, and there are all these different bullet points. And when it's done, it's signed, it is done. And those are the rules that we follow. It is outlining the rules of engagement. People in China view contracts in a really different way. They have a different lens, a different group of assumptions and interpretations when they start dealing with contracts. The words are, of course, important, but signing a contract is more of a way to establish relationships than actually create rules. And this, in itself, if you have two different people from China signing a contract, is a great meeting of establishing a relationship. However, if you have someone from the U.S. who has one idea of contracts and you have someone from China with another idea of contracts, then you start having two different assumptions about the same object that are completely different, and then people start working off of those assumptions, and then a week or a month down the line start to get really confused and judge the other person, and it becomes a very negative situation when it comes out that people have been working under different assumptions. And it's, of course, our tendency to think that our way of doing things is the right way. This is a human tendency. Don't feel guilty for this. We always think that our way is the logical way and the right way and the best way to do things. So when someone's approaching something extremely differently, we start to judge them and thinking, why are they doing this way? I don't understand. Maybe they're not very educated, or maybe they're, fill in the blank, lots of judgment. So the first step of intercultural training is really unraveling this process of assumptions. And it's a very active process, and it's actually quite difficult. But it's a really important piece to become more skilled, more confident at communicating across worldviews. Implication of this is when people from different cultures are looking at the same issues, they may be seeing dramatically different things. An example I have of this is I was working in India, and I went by a slum nearby, and I heard the story of a Western man who came in, and he saw that there was no water source, but there was an easy way to create a well. And he asked the community, do you want me to put in a well? We have funding. It'll be great. It'll be easy. And they said, yes, absolutely. And so his lens was, I have this solution. They have this need. Let me do it as fast as possible and get them water. So he drilled down with his supporting team, got water, created a well, and went back 6 months later and found out that there actually had been a lot of violence in that area, because what he did not see, because he was seeing things from a different perspective, what he did not see was that the well, where he put the well was actually in a slightly more privileged area of town, a higher caste area of town. And when people from the lower caste came to access the water, they were actually being at first run off and eventually beaten to keep them away from the water source. So again, a really well-intentioned project that seemed pretty simple from the onset, but because of the different views that people had and how hidden these assumptions were, it was implemented in such a way where it really ended up being actually destructive. I'm going to give one more way for you guys to think about this model, and this is for the more scientifically oriented mind. It also gets down to the core of how our lens, our assumptions create our reality. Is quantum physicists have found that in looking at electrons, we're not quite sure if they are particles or if they're waves. What they found, if they set up an experiment to see the electron as a wave, they will see it as a wave. If they set up an experiment to see it as a particle, they'll then see it as a particle. So the implication of this, those experiments are somewhat like the lenses and assumptions that we have. If we're set up to see the world in a certain way, we're going to see it that way. And if we've been groomed since our birth to see the world in another way, we're going to see the world that way. On the most fundamental level, this is how we're interacting with our environment. So I've set you up to understand the complexity of this, and I do have some good news. The good news is that on an international scale, we know a lot of information about these different lenses that people wear. So this is what a lot of anthropology and intercultural communication focuses on. We know a lot about predictable issues that come up when people wearing different lenses are looking at the same issues. So we have, and you can learn about this and apply this information in a participatory project. And there's quantified information about this, there's trainings out there, there's ways in which it's basically, we need to bring these different disciplines that are out there together more skillfully in order to create projects that are integrative. And that's really what I'm arguing for today and what I've dedicated my work to, my passion to addressing. So what I'm going to do for the next couple of minutes is give you a little bit more concrete examples to work with and start to see where you fit in with these different lenses and perhaps some predictable problems that you might come up against and deal with on your projects. So these lenses are often called dimensions of culture. This is ways that we can slice down culture, this really big abstract idea that no anthropologist has ever really defined, but it's something related to a shared behavior, shared ideas, shared attitudes within a group of people in different areas of the world. It's important here to note that culture is just not something that occurs on a national level. So there are different cultures between people who are more socioeconomically privileged and less socioeconomically privileged. There are different cultures between people who are engineers and people who are architects. Different cultures in between men and women. Different cultures between people of different races. So I encourage you to think of your national culture, but also the culture of being an engineer. So that may actually set you off from these different cultural examples that I'm going to give. And I imagine that there's actually more cultural similarities between engineers internationally than perhaps your different cultures. So simply put, the dimensions of culture are all the different lenses that people wear. And the benefit of learning about the dimensions of culture is that it offers a map of the intercultural terrain. Again, this is just a tentative framework. This is not what it looks like 100% when you get on the ground, but learning about these guiding concepts will give you a lot more to work with than just going in and making that assumption that your way of doing things is right, which is the common assumption for people to make. So one dimension of culture is the idea of rules and relationships. So let me explain what these things are. So the two, on a continuum, we have people who are more universalist and more particularist. So what does that really mean? For now, just ignore all those letters underneath. So people who are more universalist, and please, as I'm doing this, keep in mind whether you think that you're more universalist or more particularist, because I'm going to do a super quick survey afterwards to see if people on the line fall into one end of the spectrum or the other. So people who are more universalist focus more on rules than relationships. When legal contracts are drawn up, legal contracts are readily drawn up because of this desire to have some sort of rule. Someone who's more universalist thinks that a trustworthy person is a person who honors contracts. You have expressions in cultures that are universalist, like a deal is a deal. On the other end of the spectrum, you have particularists. Particularists focus more on relationships than rules. Legal contracts are created, but they're also readily modified. Someone who's a particularist finds that people are trustworthy if they can honor that things change rapidly, and they can honor that relationships evolve. So what you can see in comparing the two ends of the spectrum here is that if these two people come together, and let's say they're looking at a contract, then they're going to have a very different idea of what that contract means. And they're going to have difficulty trusting each other because they have different criteria for trust. So then when you start going deeper into this in a training, you start to, I would give advice around how you would deal, if you were a particularist, how do you deal with a universalist? If you're a universalist, how do you deal with a particularist? So an example of advice that I would work on with universalists is know that the particularists are focused on relationships, and that's a really big thing for them. So when they start to have kind of getting to know you chats and this attitude of, of like, let's just sit down and talk for a little bit, know that they're actually trying to figure out if you're a trustworthy person or not. And don't write it off as just small talk. This is actually a really important piece of building trust. And for the particularist, my advice would be, don't think that the attitude of the universalist, which is almost always going to be, let's get down to business, let's sit down and get this done. Try not to take it too personally, and try not to judge them as being rude. So we would dig into that more, and more importantly, we would see where you fall along the spectrum. So the universalists that we have out there are folks in the US, in the UK, those are most extreme universalists, in Japan, and then in the middle we have France, Russia, and Spain, and we have Israel, and then more on the extreme side we have Southeast Asia. Greg Sorochi, who did this, lumped in Africa to one category, which is very faulty because there's actually a lot of cultural diversity within Africa, which is another training in itself. China and the Middle East. So had we had this training before, and we saw China down here and the US over here, we could see that drawing up contracts was going to be an issue. I'll give one more. example before we go to Q&A. The concept of self. So more individualistic cultures, this is how people within the cultures view themselves within the context of their society. People who are more individualistic are going to ask, are going to use the word I, more often. They are focused on personal achievement, and they assume personal responsibility for whatever thing that they're involved in. Decisions are often made on the spot by representatives during negotiations. So people are very quick to make decisions. One way you can spot a individualistic culture is that people from individualistic cultures vacation in pairs, even alone. There's more emphasis on being alone. More collectivistic, we have in speech patterns, you hear the more frequent use of we rather than I. Decisions are often referred back to from a delegate to organization. So decisions are not often made on the spot. They're made using consensus and involving the appropriate people. In collectivistic cultures, people ideally achieve in groups, which assume joint responsibility. And you can spot collectivistic cultures as people vacation in organized groups or with extended families. So do you think, I'd be curious if you think that you are from a more individualistic or collectivistic culture. And so, or if you are yourself more individualistic or collectivistic, and maybe if folks just wanted to put in an I or a C as their answer, we can just see quickly how people are coming up. I, C. Yeah. Great. So we have a big spectrum, and I think the answers are going to keep coming in. On the whole, I see more I's than C, but it's a good mix. One important thing in any intercultural setting is figuring out who your resources are. So as you're heading into the field with a team, you want to know who's more collectivistic, who's more individualistic, who can help you understand the culture that you're going to and their framework. So what we see here, the researchers showed the US, the UK, France, and Germany. Holland is definitely over here as well. More collectivistic side, Russia, Israel, Japan, and basically all of Asia is more collectivistic. So how would you take that information and integrate it into your participatory methods? If you know that you are someone in a more individualistic culture and you're going to do a focus group in a collectivistic culture, know that the questions that you're asking shouldn't ask participants to make decisions on the spot. As we've seen in this, the proper way to make decisions and the normal way to make decisions in collectivistic cultures are to really think through the communication and perhaps even, when we go further into these different dimensions, you can look at power, you can look at gender, you can look at assertiveness. Perhaps it's not appropriate for them to be making decisions. Perhaps for your project, you need to make sure that you can get the people who are qualified to make the decisions and the right people for them to consult with at that focus group. Know that with individualistic cultures, brainstorming is a pretty common thing, throwing out ideas without thinking them through. So if you're a collectivistic person doing a focus group with individualistic people, you can really expect them to be throwing out ideas, but know that they're not really, really well thought through a lot of the time. So both of these, anywhere you fall along the spectrum, you need to be prepared for people to be falling in other places of the spectrum. And so what I really want to drive home with this is to use participatory methods effectively, you need to be competent at communicating across cultures. Communication comes into play all aspects of your project, the needs assessment, project design, implementation. And to have an integrated design of your project, you're going to want to use the human, the technical, and the environmental considerations. What I have found in the field and in my years of looking at this issue, I have found that in order to make the solutions and the needs really come together, we must become skilled at closing the interpersonal gap across the cultural divide. This is a big thing, and I feel like this is one of the key missing pieces in matching solutions with needs on an international scale. As a final, final note, please contact me. I have my email on the next slide, and this is what I do, this is what I focus on, and I'm extremely passionate about helping you guys, the one with the technical skills, implement your projects in a more sustainable way with integrated solutions so that they're holistic and they're successful. So this is kind of the end of my presentation, but I am happy to take any questions if you have them. Thank you so much for joining us today.
We would like to thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Emily. That was very, very insightful. So at this point, we invite you to share any questions with us via the chat. If you have anything for Emily, if you're curious about some specific aspects. I do see a lot of thank yous and acknowledgement.
Yes, you're welcome.
Does anybody have a specific question related to a project? All right, just still waiting. If folks have some specific questions, Emily, we may want to go back to some of the scenarios that were pointed out earlier by our community here on the line regarding some of their actual examples of how they were challenged right at the beginning. Oh, actually, I apologize. We do have one specific question, too. First question is, how can you measure the impact of this training?
Measure the impact of the training. It's hard to quantify the impact of this training. It's actually something that is a difficult piece, but basically I've worked with people in the field over time, and I actually work with people online to do coaching when they're in the field. And basically once you do more skill building around intercultural competency, things start to move a lot quicker. There's an increase in productivity and efficiency and the ability to problem solve on the fly and on the ground. You also see decreasing stress, because this causes that intercultural clash causes a lot of stress. And so that is then, you can free up the investment of time and energy that has gone into being frustrated with intercultural communication issues and actually apply it to your project in a very productive way. So you see more sustainable integrated projects coming out. And so it is learning this information involves kind of a long-term behavioral readjustment. You're kind of reintegrating information that you've been working kind of on autopilot for a long time. So sorry, I think something more concrete.
No, that's pretty good. Another question came in on how does the use of the models, and I'm guessing what the models the gentleman is referring to are the models that you showed between the collectivist, individualist, and so forth. How does the use of the models play into the process of bridging the gaps in understanding? I guess, how do you put the models into play?
So that would be like when I was talking about the universalist and particularist. If you know that you're going to do work in Southeast Asia and your team is from Germany, then what you would want to do is, before you leave, you want to work with your team, doing some skill building around what does it look like to work with people who are particularists, who are going to assess things moment to moment rather than make big sweeping statements about how things are all the time. So when you're on the ground and you ask a question like, so tell me about how you use this object in your house. And what you want is a general answer that's like, most of the time I use it this way. And you find that you're actually not getting that answer. You're finding, oh, sometimes it's like this, and sometimes it's like this, and sometimes it's like this. Instead of feeling frustrated that you're not getting the direct answer that you're wanting, you can say, okay, I was trained to know that this person's going to give me situational answers. And in order for me to create meaning that works for me around this, I'm going to take all of their answers and I'm going to make the general answer that comes out of that, rather than expecting them to conform to your style of communication. And within that, you've closed the gap a little bit between one way of understanding things and another way of understanding things.
Very insightful. Thank you, Emily. We do have another question that the gentleman wants to know. Could you comment on the effects of country stability? I suppose if you are working in regions of conflict, what is the impact of that country stability on the effect of the culture?
So, the big thing there you're going to be looking at, and this is again talking very generally, is an overriding feeling of a lack of security. So probably gaining trust of your participants is going to be a harder thing to do. What we see with the dimensions of culture is that as stress increases, people go more and more towards an extreme. So let's say you're working in Afghanistan, who's already a collectivistic culture that emphasizes relationships. They're going to be even more on the extreme of emphasizing relationships. And so when you go in there, if the first thing you say is, okay, we have limited time, limited resources, we need to get in, get out, and go, there's no way that they can trust you. There's no way. They need to know that they can trust you, and that needs to most likely come from your classic 3 cups of tea, not to say I'm supporting Greg Mortensen, but sitting down and really building a relationship. And once you leave, they want to have you in touch. And this is a really important piece of, every couple weeks, if you've made a connection, say with a village elder, send them a text message. If they can get on Skype, have face-to-face. What they're looking to know is, over the long term, not in the moment, but over the long term, are you trustable? Are you reliable? Are you someone that they can have a relationship with? And once that answer is yes for them, then you can start working and problem solving and getting a project up and running. So in the areas of conflict, that's just going to be a little bit more extreme. That's
a very good point. I couldn't agree with you more, Emily. One question more that we have here, and I think it's a really interesting one in terms of practice, is there was a question about the use of people who have many different lenses, or, for example, people who are from the local community and are highly educated with a quote-unquote world view. Could they serve as a translator of sorts when you are working with that community?
Absolutely. This is a really valuable person, either maybe from your company's team or maybe it's someone that you've identified on the ground as a liaison. An ideal person would be, let's say you're working in Peru and you have someone who has spent 5 years in the States and then moved back to Peru. That would be an ideal liaison, and it's really important to identify those resources. The thing that would help them is usually people who are really skilled at navigating that, basically the coding and decoding process. We actually call those people code shifters. Their ability to shift in between different coding systems is really high. They need to be able to articulate the differences. It's often, a lot of stuff we're talking about today with culture, it's kind of like this felt, I have a sense of something is going on and I have a sense of this, but really being able to articulate it is something that's really going to help them. So definitely use that person, and you know, if you can help them in becoming more skilled at articulating the differences between cultures, that will help them. But know if you kind of plot them down as a mediator, that they're extremely important.
Wonderful. One more question. They're coming in faster than we can get to them. One more question is, how can teams take the lessons about cross-cultural communication techniques and translate them to realistic schedule estimates while planning international projects? This is very important for managing team expectations, and this user would like to hear a little bit more about that aspect.
So, you know, in an ideal world, of course, I would add on extra days to your project to just be building relationships, because this is the big trend that we see, and especially with engineers who tend to be more direct and are really excited about the problem-solving aspects of international projects, is that time to build the trust and build relationships, which is, as a whole, most developing countries, they're more relationship focused. So, you know, ideally it would be more days, but I know that that's not realistic. What I would suggest as a starting point would be every day in your planning, plan to have breakfast with the team that you're working with, the local team as well as your international team. And at that breakfast, don't talk about the project at all. At that breakfast, talk about family, ask questions about the history of the village, talk about things that to someone who's more direct, it may feel kind of like fluff, you know, like, why am I doing this? But what you'll see over time is that is really building trust. And so if you can really dedicate time to building trust, or even another great thing would be mapping is a really great way of getting on-the-ground ethnographic research, of mapping resources, and bring people from, let's say you're in Senegal, bring people from the village with you. It may take a little bit longer. If I was to do a map on my own of a small village, it could take me an hour. If I was to bring 2 people, it may take me 4 hours. But I would get so much more information that's useful, possibly from the small talk, possibly from sitting down to have, you know, tea with an old woman that's nearby, and she tells me the key piece of information that I need. So the orientation in that is people, the more time that you can spend creating friendships with people on the ground, the more likely that this information will come up that you're actually going to be able to use. So, so it does take a little bit more time, but you can look at the time that you have and really create slots that are not problem-solving time, but just the relationship-building time.
Wonderful, and I think this is the last question we're going to take, so I thank you everybody for your questions. But one question that came in that's a little bit interesting is, can we consider or speak about the teacher-student communication relationship as intercultural communication as well?
I definitely. So I define intercultural communication as shared understanding with different perspectives being present. So a teacher-student relationship, well, it's actually different depending on what part of the world you're looking at. Because if you're looking at teacher-student relationship in China, there's a huge power difference there. The student is not supposed to question the teacher at all. I remember I was studying acupuncture in China, and I was with a group of 10 Americans, and we had a Chinese teacher, and we kept asking, why does this point work? Why does this not work? He just looked at us and said, because it's worked for 5,000 years. The idea was you don't question us. We hold the knowledge. While in the U.S., the student-teacher relationship is quite different, where it's actually really valued to question the teacher and to go in and say, okay, but challenge authority, prove that you have some thoughts that are going to shake things up. So I don't know if that really addresses the question, but it's a cultural interaction for sure, and certainly teachers, I advocate for teachers becoming more skilled interculturally, because most classrooms, they're going to have students from different cultures who will have different learning styles. based on their cultural lens.
Absolutely. And Emily, this has been incredibly insightful. I think all of us are going to be a lot more aware of our own lenses and the lenses of the groups that we work with. So I would like to thank you again, heartfelt thank you for taking the time to share with us this knowledge on intercultural communication. Everybody do please, if you haven't had your question answered or if you'd like to learn more, visit Emily's site. Her company Refresh offers training as well as further insights. The contact information is listed on the slide you see in front of you. With this, we're going to wrap up, and I would like to thank you all for attending and joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again on future webinars. Please don't forget to get your professional development hour for having participated in this webinar series. It is awarded by IEEE with a certificate of completion via email, so please send an email to the address listed here with your name, the webinar title, and the webinar code, which is listed here, Emily 0425-2012, and the certificate will be emailed to you within 2 business days. We'd like to thank you all for attending and wish you a good day, whether it's evening or morning or however much time you have left in the day, and we look forward to seeing you again on our next webinar on May 24th. Have a good day, everybody. Take care.